Hello and welcome back to the Shores of Eternum. Today is going to be a very important day, because not only are we discussing the rest of the topics touched on in the conversation with Amazon Games, but this is also going to be a massive look behind the curtains of where their mind is at, and where the game could potentially go in the future. Because of that, I do have to put some massive disclaimers on this. It's very crucial to note that a lot of this stuff is still on the drawing board. They were throwing really great questions and ideas at me, and I was providing feedback and throwing some back at them. So that means there's no definitive guarantee on if some of the stuff will happen, let alone exactly when it'll happen, but either way, I'm super excited to bring you this information today. So we've got ourselves about 7 total topics to go over, some major and a few minor ones, and some extra feedback that I wanted to relay, as well as some from the community that you guys gave to me. So let's go ahead and start with the first one that I know everyone is super curious about. It's been a hot topic in the community almost since the very beginning of Alpha 2, the mount system. Now this is one of the first things we talked about, and this is one of the parts where the disclaimer really comes in. What I'm about to tell you might seem like a definite confirmation, but what they're thinking, and if they took the feedback into consideration, might mean that we won't see this kind of thing for a while. So Amazon Games is fully aware of the conversations that have been going on about mounts. We've seen article interviews where they mentioned it previously, stating specifically that it's something they've considered, but they probably wouldn't pursue until the map got bigger. Well, the first question they gave me was this. Should they focus on designing an intricate system for mounts, where it becomes like an extension of your character, or should they try to rush to get mounts out as soon as possible to alleviate some of the travel concerns? So the first thing I thought about is, normally when people have an issue with the travel system, most of the time it's because they're lower leveled. Some people don't know that once you get past a certain threshold, you're basically drowning in Azoth when it comes to fast travel, especially if you don't do crafting. And not only are we able to travel from settlement to settlement via this method, but also the new fast travel points of interest that were added recently did come up during the conversation, and those are starting to help even further when it comes to the travel situation. On top of that, you are able to set an innkeeper at any of the towns or the outposts, and you can teleport back there at any time at the cost of a cooldown. Plus, you're able to have up to 3 house locations, each with their own teleport, and now that they've changed the housing cost, no longer would you have to save up over like 150,000 gold to get your 3rd house. Now on the other side of that, like I said before, after gaining all these hours in the game, there were some points where I did kind of feel burnt out on running around all the time. So I can understand when people start to wish for a faster way to get around or even explore. But still, I really like the idea of having an impactful mount system. Like if we have these horses, maybe they have their own progression system, we can stable them in and out of the towns and the sanctuaries, maybe hitch them to our campfires. When we get off them, they stay in the world and can potentially be attacked by enemy players or mobs. And we're also able to craft things like they mentioned, like maybe horseshoes, muzzles, bardings, all kinds of stuff. And on top of that, have a manual taming process, maybe even breeding. I do feel like people would enjoy that kind of thing, as well as not mind it as much from the folks that don't want to see them in anytime soon. There of course should also be some balancing around the mounts if they were to arrive, such as being disabled during faction PvP missions so that players can't just run away from combat kind of thing. And if they do take their time with it, then by the time we get them, the world should probably be big enough to warrant them, so that way everybody's happy in the end. So that's exactly what I told them. I said that them taking their time definitely sounds like a better way to go, and one of their questions was, do I think players would be patient enough to wait for them if they did take their time? This entire topic basically does what I told them, but I said that yeah, I do believe that people would be patient. It might get tough at times for some players, but I think as long as they know that they're being worked on or considered, then I think players would be willing to wait for a more detailed mount system. So knowing this new information, would you guys rather wait for a detailed mount system, or do you need them as soon as possible? I'd love to pass the question off to you. Second topic, the gameplay systems and future zones. So as we know, Amazon Games is always brainstorming on not just the combat aspects for New World, but also future content such as gameplay systems they could introduce and new zones. Because of that, the very next thing that came up in conversation was this. They wanted to know, should they continue to mainly focus on adding in more new zones, or should they focus on adding gameplay systems and polish, plus more life to the zones we already have? Now I did mention in the previous video, we will be seeing influences from historical places and civilizations. We've already seen a lot of influences of Greek, we've seen some Roman, but we're starting to see even more of that now, and in the future we'll probably see different ones like Egyptian, maybe Mongolian or Persian. Who knows where things could go. But what I said specifically is that I would love to see them focus on more gameplay aspects and adding more life to the current zones. One of the examples I used was games like Rift or even Guild Wars 2. One of the things I really loved about these types of games is the dynamic content in the open world. New World is doing pretty good on implementing the instance content like expeditions, even some new arenas that we spotted. Hell, even the PvP is getting some love on the dueling, outpost rush, and open world points of interest side. But the open world is still something that I think needs some work. And also leveling method wise, I feel like we still need more options to enhance the mid to late game experience. So I absolutely suggested things like merchant caravan escorts, incursions in the open world maybe that can cause enemies to attack our settlements, dynamic event chains that end up spawning bosses and bigger objectives as we complete them, maybe even open world fights between NPC humans and one of the enemy groups like the corrupted or the ancients, and then us as players can jump into that. I feel like dynamic events can be a really big part of the recipe to success when it comes to these MMOs. But not just these types of things. Speaking of NPCs, I think that not only do we need them participating in the game world through fighting, but I also talked about how it would be nice to fill these settlements with non-player characters that are just interacting with the game's world. Not like quest givers or innkeepers, interacting with the settlement or even just walking around. Maybe they can talk to the player, offer some advice or hidden lore pieces, maybe even offer a secret quest line if you talk to the right one. Things like that I think would elevate the game to have a living, breathing world. The analogy I used is that if you take all the players out of your game, that I believe it should be a case where the entire world still feels like a self-breathing ecosystem. Later on in the convo they asked me, as a player, what would be one of the things I would change about New World? And I mentioned pretty much the only piece of content that hasn't been touched that much since it was introduced: the invasions. See, when this feature was first implemented, I gave feedback on this, but I was initially hoping for an experience similar to an example I gave. One of my favorite RPGs of all time is Dragon Age Origins. During this game, there's a sequence in there known as the Battle of Ostagar. This is what I wanted the invasion of New World to be. Instead of it being something that's done in a closed area, maybe we have to barricade our settlements, build defenses, and prepare consumables and all kinds of things, and have this all play out in an open field or in the towns themselves. And I wanted it to include more people. I think at least 75 to 100 would be great. So overall as a player, if I had to change anything, I would make the invasions more open-ended, or tied to dynamic events. For example, before they officially announced the corrupted breaches and invasions, in an article interview they stated that their final goal for this system is to have it where, if we don't take out the corrupted breaches, then it can make the invasion of the fort significantly harder. I think that would be a great alternative at the very least, and they could add incursions that take place in the middle of these zones, and use those as the open world parts of the invasion instead.
These scars long have yearned for your tender caress.
Number 3 is going to be a big one for me personally, and is one that I think gets overlooked a lot in games of this genre: the social aspects of MMORPGs. Now this is the second one that kind of serves as a big teaser to where their mind is at and what could potentially come in the future. So this is another one where the disclaimer will come into play. We're not sure if and when we might get these features, but this is what they said. They wanted to know if I think social features such as multi-company alliances, musical instruments, tavern stuff, tournaments, and things like that are crucial to have in these games as opposed to just features on the killing side. Now, as we've gone through the years, the majority of what these MMOs consist of and the player priorities have dynamically changed. It's grown into more of a I need to rush to endgame and play competitively mentality. And I think a lot of people never really had the opportunity to experience a big part of what the golden age of these MMOs was really made of. But I thought back to games like Mabinogi, RuneScape in the early 2000s, Pirates of the Caribbean Online especially for myself, and so many others, alongside games I didn't get to experience in their primes like EverQuest, Dark Age of Camelot, Lineage, and Star Wars Galaxies. So I said hell yes to the social features being very important in these types of games. Now I keep an eye on the New World community. I'm always looking at what people are saying, how people are feeling, what people hope to see, and I've noticed along the way, this game has already started to build up a little bit of a role-playing community. I know there are people interested in lore as well, like myself, but we've also got other clusters of people that I think could be further catered to. Ones that are looking for more interaction-based features as opposed to just player versus environment or player versus player. One of the first things I talked about was some ideas related to the taverns. Other than setting our innkeepers, there's not really any reason to go to these right now. But what if we could do things like play Texas Hold'em poker, play some blackjack, maybe even a card game similar to Pazak from Knights of the Old Republic, Gwent from The Witcher, some arm wrestling competitions, drinking games, especially musical instruments, but we'll talk about that in a second. I absolutely think things like this can be really good. I used to play blackjack and Pirates Online for hours in cities like Tortuga. We already have the dice roll emote in New World, and we can get mini games for that too. But also, if they did implement mini games in the Tavern, we gotta be able to bet our gold and gamble to add even more flavor to it. And speaking of which, I did ask about Tavern games directly, and they did say that they do have plans, so we might actually see that in the future. Tournaments, of course, that would be awesome. I don't know if they meant jousting tournaments or things like 1v1s, 3v3s, and 5v5s, but we already know that most people interested in PvP would want those arenas anyway. Multi-company alliances, that could be pretty cool, I would say. I even saw some suggestions recently of people wanting potential ways to trade large amounts of resources or money between companies, or maybe even company storage and company housing. Actually, way back when they were first showcasing the item and gear system, I thought that this screenshot in particular was them showcasing the company housing. But now I realize that it just looks like one of the taverns, but I love the idea of that. That could be an even bigger incentive for companies to try to own those territories. And if I recall, Outpost Rush already has a mechanic where we can use a team-wide storage in the outpost to trade resources between the players. So I think a mechanic like that could be duplicated for this situation as well. And two other things I didn't mention, I forgot that in the past, I've thought about and also seen suggestions of ideas related to personal farms. I was thinking that if we can't do them in the backyard of our settlement houses, maybe they could add open world house spots in the newer zones with bigger backyards specifically built for farming, or potentially even fishing and other professions. Now, when this conversation got to the musical instruments portion, I was immediately taken back to that old school MMORPG experience, which is something that upcoming games like Pantheon are trying to recreate. Now, I absolutely love the idea of us getting musical instruments from a social standpoint. As I said, I played games like Mabinogi, which allowed you to not only play musical instruments, but you could draft up custom songs and trade them with other players. There was even websites where you could copy and paste the formula, so you could make your character automatically start playing the proper notes to replicate the tune. I believe Lord of the Rings Online had a similar system as well. I love the idea of this. I do support the idea, and it would be awesome if we could get multiple instruments and play them with a group to form an entire band sequence with it. But also, we know that currently, life staff is on its own when it comes to the focus stat. And it just so happens that bards were a lot of times very crucial to have in these old school MMOs. A class or weapon that's capable of buffing and supporting your teammates and debuffing or crowd controlling the enemy. The moment this idea came up in conversation, I knew I would have to suggest it expanding to the combat side too. The only question is, what would be the proper instrument to have for this type of playstyle? They've already added a decent chunk of weapons since the preview, but they said themselves during the conversation that they're not sure if they'll be able to always keep up this pace. And I wouldn't really expect them to be interested in designing weapon trees for each and every instrument we could possibly have. But I think the two that would probably make the most sense in this regard would be like a lute instrument or a flute. We touched on this even more in the weapon topic, but because they're thinking about this on the social side, I absolutely wanted to make sure I suggested the combat side as well. And the last social thing we talked about that I did bring up, okay, please don't laugh, but I may have suggested a friendship and a marriage system. Now, like I said, I have played games like Mabinogi and even MapleStory that are very social based, so I know full and well that there are people that would absolutely love to have a system like this, especially now when couples playing games is a very common thing you see. We could purchase wedding bands to get the process started, and then in-game we can buy tuxedo outfits and wedding dresses, potentially buy wedding packages in the cash shop for decorations and different aspects of the ceremony. It could even tie the system to in-game mechanics such as titles and housing furniture. I mean, it might sound cheesy, but sometimes it's the little things that can elevate a game on the social side and make a lot of people happy in the process. For number 4, we quickly touched on the importance of having gear sets and cosmetics obtainable in-game that are just as good, if not more so than the ones we can obtain in the cash shop. Now in the previous video, I briefly touched on how they showed me these concepts that they included in their public statement. On top of that, they did show me other ones that were in a very early state, alongside telling me that they have a lot of plans for the future of in-game gear sets in New World. Over the next couple of months, they want to see a lot more of those get added into the game. And one of the ones that I love the most that they confirmed to me is in-game obtainable only is the one that I think is called Ebon Rock Armor. This was a very bulky and deadly looking devilish armor with the red and black color scheme that looks so badass. And that's the kind of thing we want to see, because so often do these MMOs lock the best looking gear sets behind a paywall. Even though cosmetics are normally considered a less impactful way to monetize the game, having really good looking gear sets tied to things like in-game raids or dungeons, PvP in battlegrounds or arenas, special achievements and professions even, I think that's a very crucial thing to do. They said that they're working like crazy on a lot of them, like dozens if not hundreds. For number 5, we talked quite a bit about the future and the current state of the lore. One of the first things that I had a question on is about the Siren Queen, Isabella, and the Empress so far. 2 of them now have parts in expeditions, specifically the Dynasty Shipyard, and the Siren Queen we now know is a part of her own arena. But I wanted to know, would these characters have a bigger role in the future of the story, or just in general besides these specific pieces of content? And they did assure me that some of them already do or they will, and that the lore and story building in general is something that they're trying to get better at. And they did ask about my thoughts on the lore so far, and me personally, I do really like it. I like the hints towards older civilizations like the Greeks for instance, and they did do a good job on adding a lot of mystery on the game's story. But I did say that some things that would enhance it past the expeditions would be things like cinematics, flashback scenes for characters like Hazel in specific, or the Ancients. Things like that for another way to deliver the storytelling so that everybody won't have to worry about hunting down all the pages. Now number 6 needs no introduction because it's always been one of the biggest parts of New World, and one of the reasons why I'm so glad we don't have a class system, because it seems like we can go really crazy with the variety we can get access to. Now we do know that there's definitely improvements needed for some of the current weapons, as well as the system in general, like on the stagger side, which we did briefly talk about, but the majority of the topic had to do with future weapons. It started off by them briefly asking me what my favorite or most desired weapon would be, but even they knew that my very top pick would be for Greatsword. That's a weapon we've been preaching about for so long and I'm still holding out a lot of hope for. They did unfortunately confirm that the Greatsword would probably not be one of the next weapons, but during the course of the conversation I apparently did mention one of the next 2 weapons that might be. Because I talked about a few potential ones that would be really good in the future, like musical instruments for a bard, but also that I do know that we're still waiting on some, like the pistol weapon we've already seen, potentially the one-handed mace, but I actually forgot to mention that one during the convo. But I did talk about how when they first introduced Corrupted Breaches, there was a screenshot with the weapon that looked a lot like a halberd. And also that I've seen suggestions I've really liked in the past, like having strength-based range weapons. I'm talking about like a crossbow, since it might take a degree of strength to crank that back anyway, and like a blunderbuss, which would probably fit with the theme of this game. So between pistol, crossbow, and blunderbuss or halberd, one of those might just be the one in the next lineup. And just a few more ideas that I pulled from all your suggestions and memory, I want to add a few more onto that. So I've seen ones like magic wands, morning stars, or flails, like maybe a paladin type build that could go off a focus kind of thing. Of course, we know some people would really like dual daggers like for an assassin, and I remember when we first started talking about potential combat pets that we brought up the idea of a nature staff or druids. And I also saw some suggestions about necromancy, which that could be a really cool thing to see in New World too. And then the very last topic we talked about was related to the expansions, naval system, and the idea of a 4th faction. This will be the shortest one because there wasn't a lot of new detail, but basically for the expansion portion, I was very curious if they were planning to introduce a level cap increase like other MMOs tend to do when they release these. And they said that right now they're not really sure. They haven't really worried about an expansion too much right now. Their main concern seemed to be adding as much content and polish to the version we get after release, which is a really good thing to see. And for the naval system, the answer was pretty much the same. The reason I asked about it is because we have had media articles in the past on this specific topic, but none that ever really got a concrete answer. And they told me that they want to see where the game sits for a while, what they need to add, what they need to balance, and then later down the line, like towards an expansion, that's when they might start thinking about that kind of feature. And that also goes for the 4th faction idea, like for mercenaries and pirates being a thing in New World. I previously made a video on this subject and I do like the idea of factionless players having mechanics to support them, which they have actually discussed this kind of thing internally, but they're not really sure how the faction balance is going to hold up, or even if we'll need another faction, so we'll have to see what they decide to do there. But with that, that's the 7 total topics we covered during the discussion. I wanted to also use this video as an opportunity to gather some extra feedback and suggestions from the community, just in case anyone from Amazon Games does watch this one too. I probably won't catch all of them, but I did include a few of them in the previous topics already, and here's a few more of the ones I saw. I saw a suggestion about New World potentially getting some hidden Easter eggs or hidden content, maybe secret titles or achievements, and I really love this idea. It actually reminds me of how I found out a while ago. Some MMOs like Mortal Online, for instance, they had secret skill trainers and content that you could come across in the open world. Like I heard that you could find a skill trainer to learn necromancy kind of thing. And it reminds me of a news story about an MMO called Tibia, where players had actually spent the better part of a decade trying to unlock a hidden secret. And there's other games that do this kind of thing too, like Worm Online for instance. Another few suggestions touched on things like island exploration, which I would love too, but that's probably going to be tied to the naval system thing. Underwater exploration, which funnily enough, I forgot to ask about swimming, because I know there's still some people that are really curious about that. And I also saw some for treasure hunting, like in RuneScape for example. That sounds like it'd be really good for money and incentivize players to explore even more of the island. In previous iterations, I made it a mission to travel to just about every point of interest, and I gotta say that it was really nice. There's some beautiful places around this island that I highly recommend people seek out. Other suggestions I noticed were things like instance raids. So if they took the expedition concept and expanded it into like 10 player or 20 player content kind of thing, which raid groups are something I did request in this conversation, because they would be very good to have for content like field bosses, corrupted portal trains, and just open world content in general. Along with that, people had ones like recruit a friend events for later down the line, and leaderboards. But yeah, I would love to see this kind of thing too, especially because we've got titles and achievements now. And the last suggestion is one that I saw a while ago. Someone had the idea of having like a 3-sided battleground, and this reminded me of Dark Age of Camelot. And I was thinking that if we had a new zone in the future that was big enough, perhaps a portion of the map could be locked off until you captured the territory and then it opens up for your faction. Maybe this could be an area with high level resources and you get bonus gains, maybe even have open world or closed off dungeons, things like that. But that's officially everything pertaining to the conversation and the answers that I gave. Would love to know your thoughts on this stuff, and again, I do have to throw that disclaimer that there's no guarantee on when or if some of the stuff will come, but this is an idea of what Amazon Games is currently thinking about and wanting feedback on when it comes to the future. Thank you all so much for watching, have a wonderful night or day, and farewell.